Here follows an extract from my book Artful Designs, available from Amazon. Chapter 9, Part 1. The sun was bright and the unblemished blue sky boded well for a dry Saturday. A succession of dry weather had kept the volunteers of the watering rota busy, but it meant that the ground was perfectly dry and conditions were optimum for the annual WI croquet crown that day. The green was a pasture directly off the high street, which bisected the village into two halves. Directly opposite was a small row of shops which served the community of Mossleigh, and the long stretch of grass was backed by a small lake before houses once again filled up the geography of the village. Even at this early hour there was plenty of activity as people went about the necessary preparations. May, the WI president, had set her husband Richard the task of marking out the courts. Just then the hoops looked set for a game more appropriate to Alice in Wonderland. But the layout was gradually taking on a more conventional aspect as Terry shouted and gesticulated to redirect Richard before he hammered the hoops home. In the planning and preparation stage, a whole evening had been spent in the Badger finalising tournament timetables and deciding upon the rules of play. Association croquet was out of the question. The court would be too large for the space available on the green. The game would last too long for the number of competitors and, if truth be told, the rules of play were far too complicated for all but the most dedicated players. The first plan had been to play golf croquet, this being the simplest form of the game. Even beginners could take part if they chose, as it really is just a matter of taking turns at hitting a ball with a mallet through a series of hoops. This was quickly shoved out of court in every sense of the word, as too simplistic and quite boring for the more seasoned players. Croquet had acquired a reputation for encouraging a spirit of vicious competition over the centuries, and Mossleigh contestants were no exception. After much discussion and many of Arthur's famed pints, garden croquet was agreed upon. This followed the lawn or court setting, which is within a rectangle that can vary in size. If contestants played doubles, and each game consisted of only one turn through the 6 hoops, each leg of the tournament could be over within an hour. The earlier matches would be over much quicker until the competitors became more evenly matched. As it was, the size of the court meant that they would be able to host 2 games consecutively so that competitors wouldn't have to wait too long between matches. Garden croquet allows more scope for a good game between well-practiced players as bonus strikes can be earned, although no penalties are given if the ball is struck off the court, leaving not too much of a handicap for the novice players. Natalie also had the excellent idea of setting up a few hoops away from the competition courts, so that those not in the tournament could enjoy a knockabout and join in the fun. Kirsty had completed the arrangements by offering some of her white science lab coats left over from her university days, so that the referees could look the part. A referee isn't a strict requirement for a croquet match, but as the croquet crown trophy was at stake, it seemed a wise precaution to have a couple of unbiased individuals on hand. Terry had offered his expertise and, although his body wasn't as capable since his stroke, his knowledge and expertise was undiminished and invaluable. Darcy was to preside over the second court as, although she still kept on referring to hoops as wickets and was more accustomed to the American 9 hoops game, she was a seasoned player. She was to defer to Terry for advice on any dispute or discrepancy, but the committee were hoping that a pervading atmosphere of generous sportsmanship would prevail. Sergeant Maddox had been called upon to fulfil his civic duty and be present as in official capacity that day. He wasn't required to be on duty until later, but he was already wandering about the green in his uniform, albeit with his jacket off for the time being. His boss, Chief Inspector Buckley, was also hovering around the sidelines. No doubt her elevated rank excluded her from such menial duties, but as she was competing in the games and vying for the croquet crown, there was no keeping her away. Likewise, DCI Benedict James was also visible on the scene. The saxophone case slung over his shoulders suggested that he was also off duty. Beth let go of Drew's hand and ran to greet her twin brother. "Benji, you made it! Are Lexi and the girls coming too?" Benedict hugged Beth and shook Drew's hand. Lexi says she'll be over later if she can. I think that the girls will be with her too, as moral support I suspect. They hate my squeaking, as they unkindly refer to my musical attempts. I'm so glad that you and Jonty have laid aside your musical snobbery and have joined forces, said Beth. It's as Jonty often says. When you're playing in the middle of a busy field, nobody is listening anyway, said Benedict. Beth's son Jonty was a trombonist with the BBC Philharmonic, and his uncle played first clarinet in the police band, which led to much light-hearted jesting. Today, however, they had called a truce and were to play together. Jonty had called together some chums from his brass band competition days, when scores in Blackpool Winter Gardens would make or break his weekend. He tried to revisit his roots whenever Mossleigh had a bit of a do. He insisted that it was good for his pride, but Beth wondered if it was more to do with the excellent ales at the Badger, which often came with the landlord's compliments to the star who had come back home. Today, along with his uncle, Jonty and his associates made up an ad hoc swing band and were embracing the trend for all things vintage by performing a Glenn Miller tribute set. They were to set up their music stands next to the tea tent as per Jonty's instructions. He'd insisted that this was to maintain the vintage theme and would guarantee them an audience, but Beth knew her son better. Ever since he was a small boy, Jonty had possessed the knack of befriending old ladies in possession of a teapot. Nowadays this had progressed to older men in possession of a pint tap, but as the Badger didn't open until midday, he was falling back into his old ways. Who's competing in the croquet crown this year? Will it be stiff competition, or is it already in the bag? Asked Jonty. I can't remember who's in the earlier stages, but I can take a guess who'll be in the quarters or the semis, unless a wild card surprises us and climbs through the ranks, said Beth. Such as? Natalie, C.I. Buckley, May and your dad are hot favourites. Natalie has an unofficial book open on them if you're wanting to put your money on it. I'm shocked at the seedy underworld in this little village. It seems so unassuming at first glance. I wouldn't be too shocked. There's a limit on how much you can bet. I think Natalie has said £5. I'd better go and put my £5 on Dad then. Don't let me down, will you? Drew waved away the gesture. You can't be sure. Anything could happen. As for wild cards, Theo and Sally are completely unknown, and Gareth Foster can be pretty handy with a mallet, or so I've heard. Are you competing, Mum? Asked Jonty. No, replied Beth. I'd like to have played with your dad, but I'm not good enough and I don't want to spoil his chances. He's paired up with Richard today. Benedict walked over and joined in the conversation. The village looks truly amazing, Beth. I hope you win the Britain in Bloom award. Mossleigh deserves it. Every basket and hanger looks perfect. Thank you, Benji, said Beth. Everyone has worked so hard. I hope that we at least get runner-up or highly commended. Morning and night people are on rota to deadhead and water all the pots and baskets. It's never ending in this dry weather. I'm glad it's made a good show though. The village is already busy with visitors. I think that Arthur will be busy at the Badger, Eileen in her tea rooms, and there'll still be plenty of visitors requiring refreshment in our WI tea and cakes tent. Speaking of which, I said I'd help to get things ready, so I'd better be off. Beth walked over to the bunting-bedecked gazebo, where Natalie, Emma and Hetty were already busy. For the full book of Artful Designs, available in paperback or as an e-book, follow the link in the cards in the description box or find details on my website at sharonbill.com. Thanks for listening.